Senator Dr. Monroe-Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Mears.
Mr. President, I too broadly support this resolution. It has been a long time in coming. Mr. President, it is interesting that we are today debating a resolution that specifically deals with national biodiversity when COP15 is happening in Montreal. And COP15 is a biodiversity conference. And I wondered whether, with the extent of this document, if we truly have enough time to digest all that is written in it. Because, as several senators have said already today, it is probably one of the most important pieces of, or one of the most important resolutions that has come to us in this Senate for a long, long time and will have long-lasting consequences. I was a little bit disappointed that there seems to be some confusion in the document and some obvious errors that I know could have been there because the document wasn't totally reviewed. For example, it does not, underwater, it specifically does not speak to desalination. And we all know that our Barbados Water Authority has become a distributor of water more so than a producer of water. So desalination is a significant part and significant source of water in this country. But Mr. President, I marked in the document a few things, and one of them was biodiversity loss. And the Deputy President, Senator Thompson, mentioned sea eggs. And those of us who grew up, like Senator Harewood, by the beach and have family whom, if you stuck them with a needle, salt water would probably come from their veins. We will recall the days when beaches like Silver Sands were covered with sea eggs. And now, while I have not seen and I have not participated in sea eggs in recent times, sea eggs are a rare thing. But they're still there. And we have to ask, what has happened that has caused it? Is it just overfishing, or is it some of the effects of what we're doing on the land? I think it was Senator Brathwaite who spoke of products, agricultural products, like Roundup, that is banned in North America and banned in 40 countries, is still imported in this country under a new name and sold. And you have to ask, if we know this, why are we still allowing it? Is there not legislation that allows the government to stop and ban the importation of Roundup in the same way that we've banned Velpar? There has to be accountability. So we can't have a name ban, we have to ban the product. Now, invasive species, Mr. President, is a clear and present danger to our biodiversity. You've seen the giant African snail and how it's spread all over Barbados. I'm sure it provides food for some animals like the mongooses and the rats, and it probably plays its part and has found its own niche in the ecosystem. But the red lionfish, Mr. President, that we so greatly feared, Bajans have found a new use for. We eat it. And we eat it in a way that the lionfish, it frightens the lionfish, because essentially what used to be very plentiful 10 years ago is now hardly seen. It's still there, but not as much as before. And it just says that one animal will come in, and we declare that it is going to take over, and another animal declares, no, you are just food. And it provides another source of food for a different animal. And eventually all settles back down. That's how nature is, Mr. President. Now, Mr. President, there is a section of the document that deals with fisheries. And it details a quite sad story. And it's probably the first time I've seen so well laid out a document that speaks to what's happened to our fishing industry from 2010. And in this document, it lays out the tonnage of fish landed at the fishing facilities. And it shows that indeed, flying fish has dropped from 2,424 tons to 4,069. And we know the fish are much smaller. What used to fit into one salt bread now can fit, you have to put 4 into the same salt bread, because they're so small. 4 fish, they're so small. They're tiny. But interestingly, tuna has gone from 117.
Senator Mary, you may just want to repeat those flying fish numbers. I think the might even
Yes, it says in the document 2,424 in 2010 and 2016, 469.
Right. No, you said 4,000. So I know you meant.
Sorry, apologies.
But just for the record.
469.
Great, thanks.
My apologies, Mr. President. And tuna has gone from 117 to 307. Now, that's a very interesting economic upturn. And that is because, Mr. President, and you will note that the number of boats, longliners, has increased. And it probably means, Mr. President, that we're fishing tuna, which is very profitable. But we don't eat the tuna. The tuna is exported. So it earns foreign exchange. So what we have to then do, Mr. President, for all the fish that Barbadians consume is import fish. So this very, very interesting and detailed document, this excellent document, shows what has been happening to our fishing fleet and what's been happening to possibly our fish stocks. Now, I mentioned that to come to something that I would like to see happen, Mr. President. I grew up close to a fishing village and spent lots of time and have lots of family who still fish. And I go to the fish markets. I've never encountered any of my colleagues in the fish markets, but I go to fish markets at least once a week. Mr. President, I am amazed at what we've been doing to the dolphin stocks. Where you can find a dolphin that cannot measure 2 feet being sold, it is a travesty. And the nonsense being peddled that it's a different species of dolphin is rubbish. There are young dolphins that are being sold. And if we eat the young fish stocks, we will just destroy what we have. There needs to be regulation, Mr. President, that regulates the size of the fish you can land. And there needs to be fines for landing undersized fish. You can't speak of that biodiversity and preservation and allow people to destroy the fish stock. So I hope, Mr. President, that all the persons who read this wonderful document will look at it seriously, relate it to what is happening, and take some action. Now, our water resource, Mr. President, contrary to what the document says, is not all groundwater. Significant part is desal water. And if you're going to have sustainability, we still have to protect it. And we therefore have to regulate what goes into the fields in terms of agricultural products for fertilizers and what pesticides we use. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in a situation where we cannot drink what is being pumped from the groundwater source, and we'll all be paying more for desal water. Now, Mr. President, I participated on my own in something called No Cut, No Spray Month. So in May, I did not cut any grass or spray any chemicals on a small plot of land that I play around with. And I am currently paying the price for it, Mr. President, because everything has grown. Everything has grown. But what is interesting is that the trees that used to have 5 fruit now have 8. And it probably means that I have not been killing the insects like it used to be. But it comes at a price. And I listened to Senator Thompson speak of not seeing ladybirds. I would have her know that in some parishes, there are ladybirds aplenty. And there are fireflies. But in the urban corridor, where everybody cuts the grass and sprays the lawns, you will not find them. You have to go in the countryside to see them. And we must bear in mind that with everything that we do, because we human beings want things to be manicured. We want to see that lot in front of us that is vacant with 2 inches of grass on it, no retirement. But we need such things. We need to let the grass grow and let it flower and do all the things and have the insects grow and have the ecosystems. They are important. We can't have all lawns and naked concrete. The country wasn't made like that. Mr. President, with your permission, I would like to digress a little bit. We all attended the independence celebrations, and I would like to first of all congratulate all the people who received national honors. But I was particularly pleased, Mr. President, that Mr. Alombe Montley was honored. That was long in coming. But what really moved me, Mr. President, was when I listened to a tuck band integrated with the police band. It said that culturally, that we had become bold enough and brave enough to accept tuck as ours. And to be able to play tuck with our internationally acclaimed police band is a remarkable thing. And I hope that in time, those people who have promoted tuck will be acknowledged. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. This has been a really interesting debate so far, and I've learned some things from it as well. We've learned about the difficulties with some of our marine species, the problems now being experienced, as mentioned just now by Senator Maynard, the catch of age dolphins and so on. We've heard about a little bit about the birds and the bees from Senator from Senator Thompson, but it's been a rich debate, and so I don't think that we've covered a lot. It don't necessarily have to be long, but it is. I thought I needed to speak on it because it is very. This is something that is very near and dear to me, and which I think is absolutely necessary. And therefore, I rise to be able to just lend my voice to it and to support, of course, the resolution. I say it's near and dear to me because I have encountered certain aspects relating to the whole question of the biodiversity that has caused me to think much more and to research more into the issues in the area. I, for example, used to be a scuba diver, and you know, over the years, I have seen for myself the degradation of the corals, for example. I've seen the effects of damage to the coral reefs and so on. And it led me to think that this is such an important aspect of our biodiversity that we need to really do much more in terms of education, and much more in terms of ensuring that our marine areas are really specially protected. I have also, in the past, have had the opportunity to fish in the Graham Hall swamp and to eat some lovely tilapia from that swamp. And of course, I wouldn't do it now. I don't think I would wish to eat any fish from that swamp for a long time, seeing as what has transpired within recent times. But it just reinforces to me the need to have a really solid, strategic biodiversity plan, as this plan certainly seems to be pretty sound and on solid ground. And so I just want to, as I said, I've heard lots of the aspects relating to biodiversity, so I don't need to repeat or rehash them really. But I wanted to just look briefly at point 4 in the resolution, which speaks to be it resolved that Parliament of Barbados reminds Barbadians of the importance of the conservation, management, and responsible and sustainable utilization of Barbados's biological, genetic, and land resources. I just want to spend a few minutes really on more specifically on the land resources, and to speak to an issue which I trust government will take near and dear to their hearts, and give it the kind of leadership that I have seen given to projects like the Botanic Gardens, for example, the development of the Carinage waterway right up I think it's right up now to the globe roundabout. And one of the things that I've been saying for a long time, for years, I would really like to see that extended right up to the prisons, really, at Station, at Station Hill. Because remember, that's all the water course really comes, which used to end up as part of into the Corinage, was water coming from all of those areas in Station Hill and further up. And, you know, that, to my mind, would be something which demonstrates, for example, how we can develop and protect our biodiversity, while at the same time being an economic generator. Because I can see the opportunities for kayaking and you know, rowing and other water sports right up along that waterway. And so I really think that if developed in that way, that adds to our overall tourism projects and, of course, for us locals. So we see how we can put these things together in terms of generate, they don't have to be, because we are protecting our biodiversity, doesn't mean that it can be an economic investment as well. And so I would like to see something like that. But the issue that I really wanted to speak to really relates to the Barbados National Park. And I don't know how much of us may be aware, but in the physical development plan of 1988, I think it was, 1988, which was actually approved in Parliament, it speaks to the Barbados National Park. And you're probably wondering, well, what is this Barbados National Park? What it refers to is that whole area from Archer's Bay, approximately, right along the St. Andrew and the St. Andrew coastline, incorporating all of the Scotland district area, and right down to, I think it is about Concept Bay. And that has been identified as what should be the Barbados National Park. And it was repeated in the subsequent physical development plan revised in 2003. Again, approved in Parliament. And I understand, and I'm pretty sure I am aware that in the 2017 physical development plan, which hasn't come to Parliament as yet because it's still in draft, that also encompasses this whole question of the Barbados National Park. So it is obviously successive administrations obviously see it as a significant aspect of preserving our national heritage. And therefore, what we need now to see is some leadership to push that whole project and get it moving, as we have done, as I said, as I mentioned previously, with things like the botanical gardens and so on. So why am I highlighting this specifically? Because that whole Scotland district area, which is, as we know, approximately 1/7 of the land area in Barbados, is teeming with all aspects of the biodiversity of which we have been talking and speaking about today. You have lots of wildlife, you have lots of various flora and fauna. You have the coastline, where you have things like the leatherback and the green turtle and other turtles coming to nest and so on. So that is an area which is teeming with biodiversity and which, in my view, needs to be managed and regulated in a very serious way. As we know, that area is particularly fragile. The land, for example, is consisted of clays and shale and limestone and so on, but which makes that area pretty unstable. And we know the problems when there's every year when there's heavy rainfall. And only, I believe it was last week or this week, I was reading about an area in St. Andrew, for example, which is because of the situation with the road. It's almost, people are complaining that, look, if this thing gets any worse, this community is going to be cut off from the rest of this. So our plan, our strategy needs to also take into consideration, along with all the issues relating to marine life and relating to the flora and fauna, needs to be able to make sure that management of that particular area is really seriously contemplated and looked at in as we look to implement that strategy, the biodiversity strategy. It has the potential to be ideally to be the national park because of its topography, which is so really different from the rest of Barbados. It has that almost mountainous aspect of it. And so much is different. And one of the things I would really like to see is, we used to have, or we still do, what it seems to be really in need of some life and reactivation. And I am talking about the Soil Conservation Department. A lot of work. I remember in the years going back in the 60s and the 50s and so on. This was a department which did a lot of really outstanding work in that area. But it seems within recent times that not much is happening there at all. But again, that has to be part of that department and the services and the work that has been done has to be revised in order to develop the national park and the whole area of which we speak. I believe Senator Thompson also mentioned in her debate about haggis, again, for example. And, you know, I've passed there within recent times, and it really looks, again, like nothing really, not much is happening there either. But yet, that was the place where you wanted your fruit trees, and you wanted plants, and you wanted, you know, various types of vegetation and so on. You went to haggis, and you got all your trees. But again, nothing much seems to be happening there. And those departments are really important and significant as part, and will play an important part in this whole strategy of which we speak. I think that there's a lot of potential for developing that national park and creating, again, some other added tourism, tourism projects in the area. And we have a lot we can speak about in the area. We have many historic buildings and sites in that area. Covers things like Codrington College. You know, we have Cherry Tree Hill, and we have many other things happening. We have the Wildlife Reserve, for example, and incidentally, we should probably pay our respects to Mr. Below, who ran that reserve and who I understand passed away sometime last week, a sudden heart attack or something like that. But he did a lot of work in terms of, and which is all part of what we are speaking of. Again, I here to refer to Senator Thompson again. But for example, the monkeys, for example, which he developed that and actually shipped overseas, and they were used for manufacturing the manufacture of the polio vaccine, the green monkeys. So while as we say, there are going to be people who will make protests of being cruel or inhumane to animals and so on, we recognize that there are things that they can be used for and useful to in terms of the whole development and helping in the health systems for us as human beings. As I mentioned, the other aspects of wildlife, the tourists or visitors have gone to that area, and there's horse riding stables, for example, in that area. So it has the ruggedness. It is, I wouldn't say underdeveloped, but it's certainly at a stage of development which makes it right if managed properly, and we don't allow overdevelopment to take place. It has that aspect about it of being an extremely good site or area for developing or ecotourism. And I also, in that area as well, and I am told by experts, we have the Greenland site, which I understand from the experts can now be used as maybe a lake or used for maybe sport fishing but the point is, the point is, Mr. President, that is right now an idle asset. And again, it can be resuscitated. There can be fish farming, which I understand is also a possibility. So there are all aspects that we can look at as we contemplate how we move ahead with our biodiversity strategy. One of the problems, though, Mr. President, is that several different aspects of this strategy will be located in various ministries. You have aspects which will pertain to the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of the Environment, the Coastal Zone Management Unit, and I'm not so sure which ministry that, I don't recall which ministry that falls under, the Ministry of the Blue Economy, I believe. Right. But the point is that unless we have some level of coordination, somebody to be able to drive these strategies and be able to coordinate among all the departments. And we know how ministries of government operate. They tend to be, not at all seeing the big picture, but seeing it from the perspective of my ministry. And rather than looking to create solutions, you find the problem. There's a problem, but let us try to work together. And so I think that I don't know how government could deal with that, but certainly some person at a high level or some department at a high level should coordinate all of the various issues relating to our strategy that will see it move ahead. And I think that government is serious about it, because I recognize that funding, Senator Knight mentioned the aspect of some funding being set aside to drive this project. And I hope that as time goes on, a plan for educating the general population and making them to understand the importance of the whole issue will form a significant part of the strategy as well. Because I think that is a big part of our problem that many of our folks, sad to say, do not appreciate issues like, of which we are currently discussing. And I think that maybe even in terms of our school system, it may be, the time maybe is right for a subject which deals, specifically with issues relating to our biodiversity, so that our students from a very early age come to appreciate the various issues, the problems that can evolve if we do not speak to these issues, and if we continue to treat our environment in the manner in which we have been going for some time now. And so, Mr. President, I think this is a good strategy, well laid out, and I can only hope that we now have the energy and the leadership, as I said earlier, to put behind this entire strategy and to see it redound to the benefit of all Barbadians. With those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. Senator Dr. Hines.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging me. This afternoon, as we are discussing the resolution that addresses the Barbados National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan 2020 and seeks to implement this as the guiding national policy document for the management and conservation of biodiversity in Barbados, I would like to focus specifically on that action plan, the Barbados National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan 2020. It contains 12 targets, a number of actions and activities, and we expect that the timelines as laid out in the document are between 2025 and 2035. So 2025, 2030, and 2035 are the target years for achieving these 12. The document is broad, and I learned a lot from it, including about the leaf-toed gecko, which was previously thought to be extinct, but rediscovered on Culpeper Island in 2011. That was quite interesting to me. I like the fact that since I have been here, we have spoken a lot about the environment, and that is a very positive sign. It shows that there is significant emphasis on environmental issues, and that this is a priority of the current government, and that is certainly laudable. There is a focus in this document on ecosystem services, and ecosystem services, according to the document, speaks of the benefits people can derive from ecosystems. So while we focus on biodiversity, which is good, which is useful, there was something that came out of the document to me, and I think that also came out of some of the presentations today that spoke about the way in which we seem to value biological diversity for what it offers us. Not that it is intrinsically valuable, but for what it offers us. So the benefits people can derive from ecosystems. So we can see value in ecosystems because it offers something to us as human beings. This is an anthropocentric way of thinking about the environment, and is probably one of the reasons why we face the problems that we face, because we can be quite instrumentalist in thinking about many things. So what is the value of a sea turtle? How does it benefit us? Oh, you know why it is valuable? It is valuable because when visitors come to Barbados, they want to go on a catamaran or a boat ride and see the turtles. So this is why it is valuable. This is why these are valuable. And one of the things that I would hope is that we start to have, in addition to the education, which this strategy and action plan does detail. It does detail actions, including education at the school level as well as at the public level. In addition to that kind of education, which is just teaching about, when I say just, I don't mean to belittle, but it is teaching at the level of this is what biological diversity is, and these are the many strategies that we can pursue. I think it is also important for us to shift our mindsets away from thinking about the value of things in our natural environment as related to what we can get from it. It is valuable to us because we can have a whole set of services, cultural, tourism, and what have you around them, because we can generate revenue from it. And of course, these things are valuable, but this is not the reason why we should focus on ecosystems or biological diversity. The section on invasive alien species, this made me pause for a moment, considering that the most invasive species is probably humans. I don't know that the lionfish has caused more problems for marine life than we have. So while we seek to manage other invasive species, it is really important that we manage ourselves as well, that we really think about how we operate on this planet, not just in Barbados, if we are genuinely concerned about biological diversity. There are a few areas that I want to focus on. One is monitoring. The word monitoring comes up in this document several times. More than 35 times I counted, and it means different things. So we have data collection for the monitoring of shooting of birds. That is one area that Senator Maynard seemed to have been interested in during a previous debate. So we have that monitoring. We have the monitoring relating to coral reefs. We have the monitoring and management of this plan in its entirety. And if we go through the document, there are so many things, so many of the actions that require monitoring from different entities, that it raises the question about how we coordinate all of this monitoring in order to understand if this plan, if this strategy and action plan will actually be successful. And I say this because this plan also lays out what happened with the previous one, 2002. And one of the things that I noticed is that there are several gaps. The document itself notes implementation gaps. And some of these gaps have to do with funding, financing, of course, human resources and skills, legislative hurdles. But I think taking stock of what we are doing along the way, the monitoring and the verification of what is actually happening will be critical to making sure that we move beyond having lovely documents, which we are very good at putting together, towards actually dealing with the problem or the issue that we face. So when I looked at, I mentioned that already, finances, human resources, right, legislative hurdles. Also the SWOT analysis of the plan notes financial circumstances again, insufficient resources to establish a national biodiversity unit, and limited resources for it. This is under the threats. Competition from other sources seeking to execute projects. So it is quite useful that I think this strategy really assesses not only what is possible, but what can threaten that which is possible. And even while acknowledging some of these limitations and moving towards the establishment of a national biodiversity unit, the fact that this unit will comprise 7 staff, to me means that it is already constrained because of how extensive this plan is. This plan is wide. 7 staff, I am not certain that they are going to be able to do all that they're asked to do to monitor the implementation of this plan. So even though getting the resources to establish this unit might be a problem, and some people may not necessarily think that this is the best use of resources, I do think that this unit is being set up from inception to really struggle with this task at hand because it is quite small. So I would love to see that in the future it is expanded so that it does some of the coordinating across ministries as well that would be necessary, and moves in the direction of assisting with the monitoring. The next thing that I wanted to speak about is the consultation and the participatory nature of coming up with this document, and also about the implementation, which also is supposed to be participatory and include consultation. And there's another word that reoccurs, and that word is stakeholders. I hear that word in here a lot. I've read many government documents, and stakeholders is a word that we love to use, but sometimes I'm unclear as to what we mean and who are the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? Who has a stake in this? Who has a stake? And this is not to say or to imply that people have been left out, but it is to ask that the stakeholders be noted in the document. So for instance, if we have consulted with, and I do see University of the West Indies, CERMIS in there, which is wonderful, but if we have consulted with them and with other organizations and entities that are involved in the field, this should be noted, and this should be noted for transparency. This is a practice that I've seen in other places. For instance, looking at the Ford Commission's document, when we had the last constitutional review, that was provided when they looked at the commission, the Thorne Commission that dealt with local governance as well. There's a list of the contributions and those persons who participated. And I think this is important because there may be stakeholders who, for whatever reason, may not have known about this process, may have been left out, maybe inadvertently, or those who are picking up this document for the first time and are, like me, wondering, who are the stakeholders? What was the exact process that we went through? So I think it is useful to consider being clear and open as to who the stakeholders are that have been included in these processes, so that, first of all, people know, but also if there are others who believe that they have a stake, that they themselves can ask some questions about why certain groups were selected over others, because that can be quite contentious at times as well. Who are the people that have a stake? And there is some work that has been done that indicates that sometimes the use of this term stakeholder is done in a very selective way. So I, for instance, am doing consultation on trade, and I believe that there are certain groups that have a stake in this, that are interested. We believe that there are certain groups. And in doing that, we are making an effort, but we may have left out other groups that we did not envisage to have a stake, who themselves believe that they should have been included in the process. So that is just a little bit on participation and the consultative element of this, which I would love to see expanded. And there still is a chance for the expansion, because as we go forward, and this is done in a participatory way, so that various organizations, groups, and individuals who work in this area or have an interest are brought on, we know who they are, what they're doing, and what stake they have in this. And this is an area that I have particular interest in, because it's an area in which I work on consultation, and I don't like to use the word stakeholder so much, but participatory governance. Finally, the balance between development and biological diversity. And this is the one thing that is very general relating to this. We know that tourism is significant. When we think about our economy, construction is important, commerce is important as well. When we read our newspapers and we follow our news, we hear about how our business is doing for independence. How was the Black Friday sale? Christmas is coming. What are the Christmas sales like? Back to school sales. We are very much involved in the selling of stuff, consumption, consumerism. These are some of the things that are driving our economies. Even when we think about tourism, we think about the tourist spend. How much money is circulating in the economy? And I wonder if there is a way that we can appropriately deal with the two of these things at the same time. On the one hand, this emphasis on consumption, consumerism, and these kinds of commercial activities driving the economy in terms of our own activities and those of tourists. But what are the resultant effects of this in terms of the generation of waste through all of this consumption? When we go and buy all this Christmas stuff now, Everybody can be in town looking for some decorations and lights and all of these different things. Trees, plastic trees, the real trees, all kinds of things. When we do all of this and we create the waste, what are the consequences of this? For the same biological diversity that we are talking about, when we get into this habit of so much consumption that is critical to the economic activities that we seek to encourage. When we encourage entrepreneurship, we want people to make things, manufacture things. Are we doing this while being cognizant of that other element? Is there a way that we can divorce these two things and still respect both of them appropriately? Land use becomes critical in this. Some of the observations I heard today have a lot to do with land use. I used to see a lot of ladybugs when I was a child. I used to see a lot of egrets as well. Right now, in the area where I used to see those things, now I see Queen's College. Next to, there used to be a lot of area around me, and all of it is now housing development. Housing development, a school. So there is the loss of this biological diversity, and it has to do with the fact that we are doing things for ourselves which are important to us, that also are connected to, yes, we need to house people, we need to educate people, these things are obvious, but these are also connected to commercial activities, because those persons who are the developers who have established these residential areas, they weren't doing it for charity. They're doing it to earn. So how do we balance these things in ways that seriously take into consideration biological diversity? And there's still a dumps tree out there that is in Senator Thompson's former constituency as well. It's right around the corner from me. So if you need some dumps, just let me know. We have a very big one. And it is a source of a lot of gathering of children and dogs and all kinds of things. But back to my point. Our activities, the activities that we encourage for economic development, seem to sometimes contradict the activities that we want to encourage when we focus on the environment. And if we're thinking about sustainable development, we have to think about ways to combine the two of these things, to create a happy marriage out of the two. Can this be accomplished? I am not certain. But before I get to the reasons why I'm not certain, I want to highlight something very important that we've spoken about today, the coral reefs, and how important the coral reefs are for biological diversity. And thinking about these two things. On the one hand, we are looking at economic development, and on the other hand, we have to think about our environment. Remember, in 2020, we had a report from CERMES, the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies at the UWI, that estimated that around 3.8 million square meters of our coral reefs were damaged between March and September 2020. This is an instance of not getting that balance correct. Here, this report, assessing anchoring impacts of cruise ships in Barbados during the COVID-19 pandemic 2022, revealed that 28 cruise ships anchored in Barbados between March 1st and September 1st, 2020, led to 132 anchor drops taking place. And the report goes on to note that despite the financial gains, there were financial gains from this, that the environmental impact far surpasses this. So when we go through our economic activities, when we think about how we are going to manage our financial situation, the fiscal situation, when we listen to these reports that tell us about 10% growth and we fetishize the growth rates, we may also need to temper this. Yes, fetishize. We're extremely obsessed with the growth rates. People are, 10%, it can't be 10%. I don't feel the 10%. I think sometimes we need to move away from that and think about the other things. You might have a 10% growth rate, but what are some of the consequences of some of the activities that have led to this in terms of the environmental impact? And I really hope that we can find ways to do this going forward if we are going to be serious about this. How do we combine a genuine focus on biological diversity with a continued emphasis on the development of commercial activities and consumptions that consumption that threatens the emphasis on biological diversity. And we're all guilty of this. I'm guilty of it. We like to shop, we like to buy things, we throw away stuff. But we really have to all change our mindsets and really think about restructuring our economy as well, so that this environmental thing, the biological diversity, is not just in a silo in terms of how ministries operate in silos. It cannot be in a silo in all of our brains, in the brains of business persons. They too have to be conscious when they are conducting their business about these kinds of things, the environmental impacts, not just climate change, that's the one that everybody talks about, but some of these other elements that are less publicized, the biological diversity, for instance. Barbados supposedly has a population issue. I keep hearing this, despite knowing that this is a very densely populated place. And I've heard proposals from some quarters about increasing the size of the population to drive the economy once again. How does this fit with a focus on biological diversity, especially considering some of the things that we have already discussed about housing developments, about the kinds of infrastructure that persons require when we increase the population? If we increase the population, will this mean that we need more infrastructure, bigger roads, other things that can encroach on our green and natural spaces, and by extension, biological diversity? How do we manage these two things? How do we balance these two things? Even thinking about our tourism sector, we have around half a million people that come to the island annually. They require resources. Well, that is what I read. Senator Cummins obviously can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know, there might be more, maybe less. But the point is, we have people coming in to the country who increase the population size on an annual basis, and our aim is to get more of them, not less. And we may also be seeking to bring other people on to the island. How does this fit with an emphasis on biological diversity? Will this frustrate those who have been tasked with ensuring that these actions and strategies take place by the established timelines? So there may be ways to balance these things, but are other activities that we pursue in our economy making it more difficult for those people who are going to be tasked with the monitoring and implementation of this strategy? In essence, I'm saying that in this highly capitalist-driven society in which we live, there are some significant contradictions of prioritizing things such as biological diversity. We can take this back to other conversations we've been having about climate change and marine protection and all of these things, and ask how we can have a fulsome treatment of these things considering the world in which we live. So this is a wider concern. I concede that this is the world in which we live, and since it is the world in which we live, I guess we have to find ways to do the best that we can. And this strategy seeks to do this. We are in the middle of a global capitalist environment, and we are forging a way to do our very best. But I encourage those responsible for the implementation of this plan to really take seriously the concern about monitoring so that we can do the little that we can to ensure that these actions don't come back to us in another 20 years as incomplete, as we saw from those in 2002, many of which are incomplete and have suffered from things, the usual things, the resource, human and financial resource limitations. With these limits in mind, and also with my caution to let us know who the stakeholders are and how they will be incorporated as we go along in implementing, I can support this being the guiding national policy document for the management and conservation of biodiversity in Barbados. Once again, emphasizing the significance of transparency in reporting of stakeholder involvement, monitoring its implementation and progress. And I thank you, Mr. President, for hearing me.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Dr. Moronite.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me also thank all of the honourable members who have risen to their feet today to speak to this resolution. I think that what we've heard is a clear recognition of the importance of the issue, this issue of biodiversity. I believe that there has been a resounding call for making sure that in the context of the rollout of this plan, the strategy and action plan, that we ensure that education and that we bring citizens along very critically. And as been acknowledged, the plan speaks to that very solidly. I want, Mr. President, to also, as has been done from the floor by a number of members who spoke, to also acknowledge the work, of course, of the Minister responsible for the Environment and National Beautification and Green and Blue Economy, Minister Adrian Ford, and his team for putting together the strategy and action plan. We've acknowledged that perhaps in the context of the first one being in 2002, that it's been quite a long time in terms of having the strategy updated, but we've also recognized that there have been a number of developments that have happened along the way to move us closer towards implementation, so that we have not necessarily been in stasis, but that we've been moving, and that the reports that have been submitted in the context of the UN Convention have really showed the effort that has been made, as has been indicated by successive governments, in order to treat this issue. I think that we're all recognizing is one that is complex there. Mr. President, I want to just highlight a couple of the concerns that were raised and to be able to speak to them. I know that Senator Nurse would have expressed some concern, particularly in terms of, for instance, the Scotland district, and to indicate that the government had indicated that we will be setting up the Scotland District Authority. It would have been noted that this would have been held back again in the context of COVID. The legislation would have passed, but in the context of the rollout of the Scotland District Rehabilitation Programme, that the Scotland District Authority will also come into force as soon as possible in order that those two processes work together, that there is an integration, and that we have an authority that helps to guide the work, oversees it, give leadership to it as it rolls out. There, again, a very kind of complex issue for which there's no easy solutions, again, because of the conditions within the Scotland District. But that there is a plan in place to provide the leadership and management, Mr. President. The question, Mr. President, was also put on the floor in terms of the leadership and of the process and how we will ensure that there is good management and proper coordination. Mr. President, as the strategy notes, there is a recommendation for a national biodiversity unit to do just that. In order to be able to coordinate. The strategy recognizes that currently within the Ministry of Environment, that there is a team that is working on this issue of biodiversity and conservation, but that is insufficient in order to give the necessary priority that is needed to this issue. And therefore, the strategy is making a call for a dedicated unit that will then be able to monitor the course of implementation, build coherence, be able to ensure that what has been articulated actually comes about, and be able to then also bring others to the table in order to advance implementation. I want to acknowledge that, as indicated by Senator Dr. Christina Hines, that perhaps the National Biodiversity Unit of 7 persons might be not enough, Mr. President, but we start somewhere. We start somewhere with a unit a dedicated unit that builds on a number of initiatives, including a cabinet working group that I would have spoken to, including the efforts at mainstreaming the issue across several departments as well, so that those 7 persons working within that unit are not working on their own, but they're also as well working with other stakeholders. You made the point, Mr. President, previously, that this strategy, this national strategy and action plan is one that is not just owned by the government, but is also owned by us as individuals, and also the private sector, other agencies, CBOs, community groups, etc., that all will play a role in terms of implementation, also assisting with monitoring. But now that we have a structure that allows us to do that, we start somewhere, Mr. President. I also wanted to address the issue that was raised by Senator Maynard in terms of the fish stock. And as I would have noted previously, the Cabinet will be considering very soon a fisheries policy, and the fisheries policy is intended to provide a framework for us to address issues of overexploitation, but also as well capacity building within the fishery sector, education within the fishery sector, as well enhancement of the physical infrastructure to do with the fishery sector. Again, to ensure that we have a comprehensive policy that addresses the multifold issues that are impacting on the sector, again, in the context of preserving our biodiversity. So that, again, if we look at this document, Mr. President, and all of the reports, the 4th national report, the 5th national report, and we will see that all along there have been different plans that have been rolled out in order to be able to supplement the overall strategy. And that kind of process will continue. It is an iterative, evolving process that we have to then be able to understand that we cannot, in the context of everything that we've talked about here, the complexity of the process I spoke to before, the need in order to be able to protect, to be sensitive to the development, to be sensitive to the fact that we need to be able to use these resources in a sustainable way. And we know that Senator Hines wasn't here, Dr. Hines, sorry, wasn't here for the beginning of the conversation, but certainly we would have spoken to the intrinsic value of the ecosystem and of the biodiversity in itself. We would have spoken to that at great length. And also as well, the word balance would have been used several times in terms of how we balance the ecosystem and what happens, and in the context of our human advancement and development. I think, as was recognized, Mr. President, again, it is not an easy solution, but it requires individual responsibility. And I hope that in the context of that question about balance, that there is a recognition that this is not something that government can do. Government will do as much as it can. We note as well that the government had introduced a policy for banning single-use plastics as well, and that was also in an effort, Mr. President, to then be able to address the issue of behavior change, behavior modification, then down the line also as well dealing with the issue of pollution, etc. So the government can create a legislative and policy framework, but we also have to take responsibility as well as citizens and as members of this community as well. Finally, Mr. President, as I close, I want to also as well note that and coming back to the point, I believe that it may have been Senator Nurse, and as I began, spoke to the idea that we need to ensure that we can bring the citizens of Barbados along. And one of the key groups within that has to be young people, Mr. President, as a critical set of, and before we don't like the word stakeholders, but a critical group of stakeholders in this. And as you would see in the strategy, there's clear focus on working in schools, so working from what you would call the ground up and making sure from very young that we also as well are reinforcing that message and instilling within young people a clear understanding of the importance of biodiversity. I take note, Mr. President, of the call for us to be transparent in terms of the stakeholders that have been involved in the consultation. And while no comfort may be taken from this floor, Mr. President, I do want to assure that the consultative process was extensive. It continues, Mr. President, not only in the context of having workshops and focus groups, but again, I point to the cabinet working group. Again, that involves stakeholders as well, not just government, private sectors, CBOs, individuals with key expertise. There's a clear understanding by this government that we cannot drive this on our own, Mr. President. Clear understanding that there has to be a shared responsibility for this plan to be successful. Mr. President, again, let me thank all of those who have commended this policy and led it to support. And again, noting that we stand in agreement that this is a significant resolution for this House. Mr. President, I beg that this resolution do not pass.
The question is that this resolution, Parliament accepts the Barbados National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan 2020 as the guiding national policy document for the management and conservation of biodiversity in Barbados and the associated reports do now pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting says have it. This resolution is therefore now passed.
Day of July 2015 and was published in the Official Gazette as Resolution Number 20, 2015 on the 3rd day of August 2015, approving the lease to Rotary Club of Barbados South of a parcel of land, the property of the Crown, situate at Garfield Sobeys Sports Complex, Upton in the parish of Christchurch in this island, for the construction and development of a recreational facility for children with disabilities.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg your permission to treat two items on the order paper at 3 and 4 as a cognate debate.
The question is that items 3 and 4 on the order paper, which relate to the rescission of a resolution previously passed and the approval of a new resolution on the same parcel of land to the same entity, essentially, be treated as a cognate debate. Of course, just to be clear, they will naturally be voted on separately as resolution item number 3 and item number 4. The question is that these items 3 and 4 be treated as a cognate debate. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The thing is the ayes have it. Proceed, Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise today to go through a bit of background on this particular resolution. This resolution in its principal form dates back to 2010. At the time, the Rotary Club of Barbados South indicated its interest in leasing approximately 25,000 square feet of land in the area of the Garfield Sobeys Sports Complex at Wildy. Mr. President, that lease was subsequently approved by the then cabinet. It was approved by the then parliament. It was passed through the Senate, and it was proclaimed thereafter. That process, as I have just outlined, between the initial arrangements in 2010 and thereafter the proclamation in 2015, then came to culmination in 2017, where it was proposed then to actually finalize the lease. At that time, the then administration of the Ministry of Housing discovered that there was not an entity so-called the Rotary Club of Barbados South. And I wish to treat to that not just as a policymaker in government, but as a Rotarian myself. And I say this because the Rotary Club internationally and the Rotary Club locally is not permitted by any of its regulations to own assets. It is required to create dedicated trusts managed by trustees that then take responsibility for any assets and their administration. And it is on that basis, therefore, that you will never anywhere hear of a Rotary Club owning the asset. And I will speak during the course of my presentation on some of the assets in which Rotary has invested resources raised through its philanthropic activities, but it does not own those assets. And so on that basis, in 2017, the then Ministry of Housing discovered that it could not lease the land to an entity called the Rotary Club of Barbados South, and that the correct name, as had been registered by Rotary at the time, was the Rotary Inclusive Play Trust. And that trust was therefore established for the purpose of taking responsibility for this 25,000 square feet of land. In 2017, thereafter, by the time this process was completed, the election of 2018 was called, and a process that started in 2010 ought to have culminated long before, then found itself in 2018 incomplete. Now we are here in 2022, and we are treating to, in the first instance, our order number 3, rescinding the original resolution, which called for the vesting of the lands to an entity called the Rotary Club of Barbados South, and instead vesting those lands at order number 4 to an entity called the Rotary Inclusive Play Trust. And that is the same tract of land, it is for the same purpose, and it is for the same group, but just structured very differently. Now, Mr. President, I was president of the Rotary Club in 2015, 2016, not this club, a different Rotary Club. And when I first joined the club, I heard of this particular project. When I became president of my club, the Rotary Club of Barbados, not the Rotary Club of Barbados South, I heard of this project. There were 2 clubs originally who partnered. There are 3 Rotary clubs in Barbados. My club is the parent club. Rotary Club South is the smallest and the youngest club. And Rotary Club of Barbados West is the 3rd club. Rotary Club of Barbados South and Rotary Club of Barbados West partnered and raised funds for the purpose of developing this particular project. And over the course of this life cycle, between 2010 and today, 2022, the commitment of the Rotary Clubs of Barbados to supporting inclusive play for children with disabilities, and not just disabilities, but I want to make it clear that it is children with disabilities and children with special needs in Barbados remains a constant. All of the things that needed to be changed, all of the things that may have been done incorrectly because people simply were anxious to have a project that was important being brought to fruition, did not make any changes, Mr. President, to the commitment of the Rotary Club of Barbados to support and capitalize this project. And it is there, Mr. President, that I want to anchor my comments, because among us here today we have honorable senators who are Lions, others who are associated with Optimists, others who are associated with Kiwanis, and myself, a Rotarian. But we also have people who belong to their respective church groups, their respective community groups, their respective various associations, and some people in the chamber are reminding me of their respective lodges. Yes, we have any number of persons who, in their civic-minded activities, are committed to ensuring that they can partner both with each other and in our communities to be able to bring projects like this to our country. Now, here is what this project is intending to do. Mr. President, I remember the current president of the Rotary Club of Barbados now, not Rotary Club of Barbados South. I remember when she became a member of Rotary, a parent of a child with special needs herself. She knew what it was like to navigate life dealing with a child with special needs. She knew what it was like to navigate life dealing with a child who was on the autistic spectrum. She knew what it was like to be able to have a challenge with trying to find placements in a mainstream school for her autistic son on a spectrum. She knew what it was like to put that child in a mainstream school and not have the professionals who were there unable or in a position to identify that there was something not quite so right. And so one of the early projects that I remember her investing in as a member of Rotary was a seminar at the Caveville School of Business, partnering with the University of the West Indies and others to have a seminar so that teachers in classrooms can identify when a child is behaving differently than you can see other children. What does that mean? Does it mean that that child is problematic? Is that child hard ears? That child is to be sent into the corner? No. That child sometimes may be on the spectrum, and you may need to be able to identify that child. And a story that one of the persons who participated in that session that day spoke about stayed with me. She told a story, Mr. President, of a teacher in a classroom. And teachers, you know, at the end of the school year, you close off your classroom, at the beginning of the school year, you come back and you're excited about your children being back in class, and you're changing it around, and you want to make it exciting. You're painting, you're putting different things down, and you move the classroom, and you set it up differently than it was set up at the end of the last term. And this little boy, he was probably around 4 or 5 years old. He was nonverbal, but he was used to doing things in a particular way. He was used to coming in, he put down his bag, he moved, he knew where his desk was, he sat down, he had a routine, he had structure, and everything was in place. And the teacher changed around the classroom to begin the new school year. And this child came in, and day after day after day, he did exactly what he did last term. He put his bag exactly where he put it the term before. He tried to sit down exactly where he sat the term before. And the teacher did not know, because she had not been trained and had not been exposed as to what that could have meant. And in the wrong circumstances, it may simply have put the teacher in a compromised position, because she doesn't know how to deal with this child and how to get the child to do what is, in principle, the right thing, the thing that he is being told to do. In the wrong circumstances, that child may seem as though he hard ears. He floating authority. I purpose in my heart this, why doing it? That's exactly what I'm doing. But that child turned out to be on the spectrum. And routine and structure becomes so important to a child on that autistic spectrum. And so the president of the Rotary Club of Barbados, Ms. Tracy Knight Lloyd, and her son Ade have then led the charge in ensuring that people all across Barbados know what it is like for her and the other parents all across this country who navigate life with children on the spectrum, and ensuring that not only are they a part of normal day-to-day activity, but that they have been able to have the life live life as fully as they can. And that is a child with special needs. That is not a child with a physical disability. That is not a child who sometimes we go out into a play park and we may see a child who doesn't walk like us, who may not be audible, who may not be able to hear what we are hearing. And you find people staring because it looks different to what they're accustomed to. You may find a child on the floor having a complete fit, a complete meltdown. We see it as a tantrum, but that child may be on the spectrum and they're responding to changes in their routine that they were not familiar with. And Rotary felt, and still feels, that it is important for children with special needs, with disabilities, to be integrated alongside those who don't have those special needs, so that there is the principle of inclusion, so that they are included, but also there is an opportunity for persons living without disabilities living without special needs, living without any of those challenges, to begin to see others who are as normal, to minimize the incidences of staring, to minimize the incidences of bullying, to normalize the way in which we interact with people, and so to create a more just and a more inclusive society by starting first and foremost with children practicing and living inclusive play. This is what this resolution is about. Now, I happen to also serve as a trustee on a different project where we do have another trust. And there's a project that some of you may know. It's called the Schoolhouse for Special Needs. It is a project in Britain's Hill in St. Michael where the Rotary Club of Barbados, my club in this instance, would have identified over many years how many parents of children with disabilities and parents of children with special needs have had challenges getting their children into the schools that are dedicated for that purpose. The waiting lists are long. The time to be able to get, I know one parent who says that when their child was first diagnosed as having a difficulty when they were a toddler, that child was 10 years old before they got a call from an institution to say, there is a place available for you. It's a long waiting list, and sometimes parents get frustrated because the options are few, and I want to take the opportunity to commend those schools that are there, and Gil and all of the others who are doing exceptional work and creating safe spaces for children with special needs, and as well as those schools that are providing services for children with disabilities. But the Schoolhouse for Special Needs also was one of those projects where we knew we needed to make sure that there was an opportunity for children with special needs to be able to have a normal life. And so the Rotary Club of Barbados, we purchased the land, we built the infrastructure. We've just actually completed a few months ago, maybe a few years ago now, the donation of a $25,000 solar paneling for the building. There are now cooperatives where you have these kids who are doing beautiful pieces of art, and they have now been able to have their own cooperative. And those things have gone all across the world as part of Rotary International's conventions, because these children are being encouraged and enabled and empowered with their parents to live normal lives. So this particular project at the Garfield Sobers complex is envisioned to include a couple of things. One, a recreational center. Two, a specialized swimming area. There's a playground with specialized equipment to be used by children with disabilities, and we also will have an indoor area that allows for specialized activities to take place, including sensory stimulation for children who need that. That is so critical, Mr. President. When you live, I have watched, I think, was it Independence Day? And one of my colleagues spoke about Independence Day earlier. Independence Day, when we had the parade and it came down into Bridgetown, Mr. President, at one point I went across the street over by the bridge, and I went to see my friend. I called her name earlier. She's living with a son who is in his teenage years, and he is autistic. But he came out to view the parade, and he was like, "Hi, Auntie Lisa," and he's talking to me. And he's there, and he's enjoying the activity and the socialization. But there's so many children for whom parents don't know how to manage a child with special needs or children with disabilities, and they stay in their homes. They're not socialized, they're not active, they're not integrated into society. But that's a real challenge, Mr. President, and I want to also make the point that a project like this also speaks to inclusion, not just for our children and their parents, but for those who in some instances lack the financial resources to be able to invest in a lot of the physical therapy and all the other stuff that is necessary oftentimes to be able to get your child socialized and engaged to a certain level. In some instances, children who start out as nonverbal, who become verbal and who are able to speak, children who have physical disabilities, or in some instances, who just simply were sedentary because there was no space that felt safe. It creates that inclusive framework as well for parents who just cannot afford to be anywhere else. And that's something that is powerful. But I want to go a little bit beyond that, Mr. President, for just a moment, if you would allow me. I want to go, Mr. President, a little ways beyond children with special needs and a little ways beyond children with disabilities and the notion of inclusion for that category of persons, which we agree, I'm sure all of us can agree is important. But we understand that this is important because the opposite of inclusion is exclusion. We understand it is important, Mr. President, because if people don't feel as though they can live what they see, they will do what they know. And sometimes that can be a negative, Mr. President. Mr. President, I had a long conversation with a couple of people over the last few days on different things. And one of the things that stayed with me was that parent who said to me, they're now an adult, but they have never done some of the things that some of us in here take for granted. And I'm not talking about things for persons with special needs or disabilities. We take for granted that people know how to function in certain spaces. We take for granted that everybody knows what it is to go to a fine dining restaurant. We take for granted that everybody knows how to effectively resolve conflict. We take for granted that people know how to talk to each other in an appropriate and in a respectful way. We take a lot of those things for granted, Mr. President, because sometimes that's how we've been socialized. Those things come normal and natural to us. But for so many people, people live what they see. People are able to replicate what they know. And so in instances where we are talking about a resolution here now, Mr. President, where we want to be able to live in a Barbados where children with disabilities and children with special needs are able to exist alongside those children without and are able to be included in society and live life normally. We also have to evolve into a space, Mr. President, where people who live in income gaps, in income categories that potentially do not have access to some of the things that some of us take for granted need to also have a space to be included. Because otherwise, they are going to function in a dysfunctional space where they have been excluded and they know nothing other than what they have seen. And what they have seen may not be in the best interest of society. I want to take a moment here as well to speak about the issues relating to bullying. There is something almost fashionable about how nasty and snarky you can be to someone else. There's something almost fashionable about that. There's something almost fashionable about how you can give somebody side-eye and make them feel badly. And in the context of this particular resolution and the group of persons that we are speaking about, Mr. President, in so many instances, we have persons with disabilities, persons with special needs who have been subjected to bullying, no matter how we describe it, and we have to be able to call it that, and it is time for that to come to an end. We have to come to a space where we do not encourage bad behavior or call bad behavior by another name to make it okay, Mr. President. We have people in this country who don't always look like us. I see some of those ads on TV sometimes asking us to give money and donate to help causes in other parts of the world. Persons with cleft lip and those kinds of things. You see those ads all the time. And it's important to be able to support the causes that you feel are important to you. But Mr. President, at the same time, there are people who live right next door to you who you may be so wicked to in the way in which you treat to them. You look at them sideways. They don't talk like you. They don't look like you. They may walk with a limp. Their child may have special needs. And you say, well, she better go home and take care of she half-breed child. We say things like that without realizing the pain that we are inflicting. It is time for us to do better. It is time for us to be better. Because the world in which we want to live has to be that inclusive space, Mr. President. Now, Rotary also, as is the case with every other service club that I have seen, and all of the members of what we call the third sector, they have an opportunity to partner with government in ways that potentially we may or may not have done so far. Now, this particular project, Mr. President, in principle, is going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is hundreds of thousands of dollars that will be raised not by government, not by taxes, not by taxpayers, but it is going to be raised through philanthropy. One of the reasons why I've been proud to be a Rotarian, Mr. President, is because 100%, not 95, not 90, not 50, 100% of all monies raised in fundraising activities must go back into projects like this. None of the things that you see Rotarians do, none of our social activities, none of our administrative costs can come from monies which are raised from the public. On Sunday, I'm gonna be serving drinks at Carol's by Candlelight in my Rotary shirt. And 100% of the proceeds that will be raised from Carol's by Candlelight will and must go back into projects in the community, 100%. That is one of the things that social service clubs hold dear. It is important to us. And so when we come to say we want to lease land to do a project at the Garfield Sobers round the gymnasium, the money, hundreds of thousands of dollars raised by whomever is going into this project. It is 100% of the project, of the money going into that project, and it is something with which the government can partner, the private sector can partner, and allow us to take a small project or a medium project and make it into something grand that serves the public purpose and helps to be beneficial to our communities and to our people. This is what I am hoping that more projects can do. The Kiwanis, for example, the Kiwanis do amazing work with children. You have the Seroptimists. I grew up with my great aunt as both a Seroptimist and a lion. I know what it was to go to, especially at this time of year, oh my goodness, every single lunch, every single activity, everything at this time of the year, I used to go with my great aunt to, as a Seroptimist and a lion. And you had to go as a child. It turned out, I suppose, probably because of her influence, that I became a Rotarian. But there is also an opportunity, Mr. President, for more Barbadians to sign up for social service activities. How many of us go to work, go home, practice in our disciplines, hang out with our friends, but don't participate in anything that gives back to our societies and to our communities? There is a space for more Barbadians to do that. I was one of the most proud people when the government of Barbados, as part of its support to the University of the West Indies, instituted a Give Back program. Because we have to begin to socialize Barbadians into giving back. We grew up going to church on a Sunday morning and then going back to church on a Sunday evening, participating in harvest, being part of the outreach into communities. Some of us would have been in clubs. I was in Interact. I was in Rotaract. When I was at St. Michael's, I was in Rotaract when I was at BCC, and I became a Rotarian when I was an adult. There are so many of us who live lives that are centered around just us, just what suits us. And if I were to hearken back to the debate that was just concluded, where we said we only see things that are beneficial if it is beneficial to us, as opposed to what it is on its own merit, that is who we must also be as people, not just in terms of our substantive work, our approach to our work. If it is that we can only see what somebody next to you, somebody down the road is having a hard time, you don't need to join a club. You don't need to be a part of a group. Sometimes you can do it all on your own. When we go to the supermarket, when a month comes, pick up a few extra things for some people. There have been times, Mr. President, where we have run programs in supermarkets where we have encouraged people, when you buy your supermarket goods, put a couple of things, excuse me, in a can that is there, in a container that is there, to go for a family who is in need. The Salvation Army is another entity that is out there right now with their cattle initiative. How many of us are walking past them every single day, day in and day out, without giving $1, $2, when their target is $750,000? I heard it this morning on the news. Their target is $750,000 to raise, and it's not going into anything else except helping people, supporting people. You have the Rotary Club of Barbados South. On any given evening, there are several evenings during the week, you will see them right here in the square feeding the homeless. And you know, one of the things that I love about Rotary and certain service clubs, you will never, this is important to me, you will never see the beneficiaries of Rotary support in the press. It's not what we do. There has to be dignity about giving to other people and providing service above yourself. you will never see us showcasing the people who we help in the public space. We may showcase the project, you'll see that, you'll see where your money goes, but never for individuals. And governments have a responsibility, I believe, to partner with the Salvation Armies, the Red Crosses, all of the service clubs, the churches, the community groups, Haynesville, a lot of those communities, Israel level, they are doing tremendous work in our communities. And this really is an example of community service and third sector collaboration as part of a national development agenda. And that is what this is also about, Mr. President. But there are still some needs that are outstanding. We need to be able, as part of our education reform process as a government, to ensure that the projects that I talked about earlier that we would have done as a service club to enable and to empower teachers to be able to recognize what some of the signs are of children with special needs, that we need to be able to expand that training. We need to have dedicated facilities that do allow for children to be integrated so that they can play alongside children without disabilities and without special needs. We need to also be able to look at what is happening internationally in terms of the international philanthropic associations and service entities. There is a significant amount of resources that can be made available to a country and to service organizations when they partner with international organizations and international philanthropic groups. Mr. President, I don't want to spend a whole heap of time on this resolution today because I think that there are those, and I deliberately have not spoken at all about some elements of the resolution, especially as it relates to the work that this administration has done on things like the establishment of a National Committee on Disabilities and the work, because there are senators in this chamber who will speak because they sit on that committee, and I defer to them. I wouldn't want to steal their thunder. I give them the opportunity to speak about the important work which is being done on that committee, and there are other senators in here who I think will also add value from the government perspective. But I want to be able to anchor my own comments in the importance of third sector collaboration, the importance of service organizations, and the importance of government collaborating with those entities. And so on that basis, Mr. President, this administration supports the resolution first, to rescind the original vesting, to create a new framework where we vest the land in the entity which has been created, and to ensure that the project is then fit for purpose and that it is able to move forward with a lease in hand and therefore attract additional support from partners under the umbrella of the Rotary Inclusive Play Trust. And that thereafter, Mr. President, as a government, we can also see other projects, similar projects in a range of areas coming to the fore with other agencies, other service organizations, other third sector groups, other church groups, other community groups that say, we are committed to an inclusive Barbados. We are committed to a collaborative Barbados. We are committed to a Barbados that works together with the public sector, the private sector, and with the third sector to be able to achieve the goals that we all have set for ourselves. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummins.
Mr. President.
Senator Tate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I understand it, what we're doing this afternoon is regularizing an error. So it's more like a legal matter as far as I'm concerned. The assent was given to an entity that, as I understand it, did not exist. And we needed to get it from the Rotary Cover Barbados South to the Rotary Inclusive Play Trust. Simple matter, but it has to be done properly because you really can't be vesting in an entity that doesn't exist. So in keeping with the purpose of this resolution, let me be clear, I have no issue with what is being envisioned for children with disabilities. I think that is an area, I actually have a sister who was very passionate about that type of thing. But for me, Mr. President, In this resolution, there is reference to Her Excellency, the Governor General. On the 28th day of July 2015, there was no such creature on the 28th day of July 2015. We had a male Governor General on the 28th day of July 2015, and my position is if we are fixing and we are correcting, let us do it holistically and properly. It means, therefore, sir, that the resolution that runs from our website, that's presented here, the addendum that was presented, I believe, on the Parliament website, all of them need to be amended to properly reflect that on the 28th day of July 2015, we would have had a male Governor General. And there are some people might think this is not a big thing. I am of the view that we really do need to be careful what we're doing in the upper chamber so that situations exactly like what we're doing now do not have to exist. We can stop having to make these amendments, stop having to make these changes, so that we don't end up with a situation where we don't know what we have because we've made so many changes. That's the first thing that stood out to me, but that might be because of my training. And yes, there's provision in certain places that you use his and her interchangeably. Funny thing is, though, for the most part, you usually see the male being used interchangeably with the female. You don't usually see her. I believe this has happened because we have a female president, we had a female Governor General, and so people saw it that way. But for me, we are doing a rescission, we're doing a fixing. Let us fix properly because we are the upper chamber and we are the Senate. So I'm asking, sir, for purposes of completeness and just for doing things properly, sir, if we could change it to His Excellency, because it was Sir Elliot Belgrave who was the Governor General in 2015, and therefore, if we're fixing it, let's fix it. Much obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Tate. Senator Boyce. Money?
Mr. President, thank you for recognizing me. It is with some degree of joy that I rise to speak in this debate and to contribute to what is hopefully the passing of this resolution. Mr. President, the project which the resolution concerns, in my view, represents what is possible for this country as we move to not only include persons with disabilities, but to transform the country in their name and in their interest. Let me start by thanking the Rotary Club of Barbados South for its vision of inclusion and equity, a vision that includes children with disabilities and one that importantly, Mr. President, fosters interaction between children with disabilities, children with special needs, and able-bodied children, and creating a space in which they can all play, recreate, and develop. Similarly, Mr. President, I must thank the Rotary Club of Barbados for keeping the dream alive, the Honourable Leader of Government Business indicated the perhaps long road that it has taken to get here. That notwithstanding, Mr. President, I think thousands of Barbadian children, disabled and non-disabled, and their parents will come to be grateful for the Rotary Club of Barbados' perseverance in this matter. As we have heard, the facility will allow, Mr. President, for sporting facilities as well as indoor recreational facilities outfitted with sensory aids and equipment, spaces for cultural activity and cultural and other activity. Importantly, Mr. President, it will provide parents with the opportunity for respite, the opportunity to leave their children at the facility so as to permit them to complete chores and run errands and get time for themselves. Mr. President, the parents of children with disabilities will often say to you that raising a child with a disability or with special needs is a 24-hour responsibility from which they get no rest. And it is initiatives like these that provide the opportunity for them to get some degree of rest in the context of a society that is largely intolerant, Mr. President. A society where parents of children with special needs and disabilities have a legitimate fear because they see and experience firsthand the intolerance of the society in which we live. And so they prefer, driven by that parental instinct, to keep their children close and to protect them from the vagaries of intolerance and discrimination. Mr. President, the initiative, the Inclusive Play Project, one of the tenets of it is to allow children without disabilities to interact and to play with and to develop alongside children with disabilities and with special needs. I cannot tell you how fundamentally important it is, as a person with a disability myself, to have an project like this that allows that kind of interaction. I grew up in Barbados in the 90s and early 2000s, I suppose. Yes, Santiago. You are. Where these projects did not exist, where parents, out of an abundance of caution and inspired by that parental instinct, which I referred to earlier, kept their children at home. And there was no place for them to recreate and to interact with people sometimes outside of their immediate families, Mr. President. And so this initiative changes that in many ways. On the other hand, it provides an opportunity for able-bodied members of our society to get an appreciation for an understanding of children with disabilities and special needs. I'll tell you a story. I'm not very good at stories, but I'll try. When I entered school in Don't worry about it here. The math don't work out. When I entered school, Mr. President, in infant school, I was taught by a particular teacher who sat the entire class of 20 of us down and explained to the class the ways in which I, as a person with a disability, was different and required the assistance of my colleagues, and how I, as a person with a disability, even as a person with a disability, was much the same. And that though I would require their assistance from time to time, that I was just like them. And it is that spirit, Mr. President, that I think characterizes a project like this. I will tell you that that teacher, in that simple interaction with a class of 4 or 5 year olds, created an environment in which I always felt safe, an environment in which I always felt protected, and an environment in which I knew that I was loved, Mr. President. That conversation has spawned a 30-year friendship with the person who is my best friend in all the world. And so, Mr. President, this kind of interaction is not an esoteric thing. It is not a theoretical thing. It has real life and practical implications for children with disabilities and special needs and those without. Much in the way that the Rotary Club of Barbados South is creating space for children with disabilities and special needs, as evidenced by this resolution, the government of Barbados is doing the same thing. As it attempts to create space in our laws, in our policies, and in our programs, Mr. President, the Honourable Leader of Government Business referred to the establishment of the Committee on Improving the Lives of Persons with Disabilities in June of this year. A committee tasked with a couple of things. One, the drafting of a comprehensive disability act that responded to many of the realities, but if we are to be honest, the vagaries and untenable realities of persons with disabilities. And also to draft, and also, Mr. President, to propose policy to the government of Barbados in that same vein. The government, in deciding to do that, Mr. President, has set about to build an infrastructure of inclusion that I hope goes on to transform this country and to not only respond to the particular harsh realities of disability and special needs across our society, but goes on to inculcate in all of us a culture of inclusion. Let me say that over the last 6 months, from June to November 30th, that committee met with all of the ministries, departments, and agencies of government, the 21 organizations that exist under the auspices of the Barbados Council for the Disabled. We also met with the Bankers Association, the labor movement, the faith-based organizations, to name a few, Mr. President, and in dedicated town hall meetings with the general public of Barbados to get an understanding of what they thought should be included in a comprehensive disability act and policy. Admittedly, Mr. President, we are a little bit behind the curve on this issue. Barbados ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which of course is the international treaty that treats to the treatment of persons with disabilities in 2013. And between then and now, has only had a spattering of legal protection for persons with disabilities. But this act, or the act that the minister has indicated will come before the House in the early part of 2023, and the policy will not only, Mr. President, treat to our international obligations, but it will hopefully mechanize change in this country in a way that we have never seen, so that some of the things that the community of persons with disabilities told us about in those meetings will come to an end, and some of the things that the leader of government business spoke to as well. Because they are real issues, Mr. President. When a parent of a child with a disability tells you that they have moved their child in its young life to between 7 and 9 schools, hoping, Mr. President, that they can get the accommodations and the quality of education that we all deserve, Mr. President, it is an issue that needs to be fixed. When, as a person with a disability, there are things that are not accessible to you, the thing that immediately comes to mind is the extent to which some persons with disabilities can't, for instance, use the automated telling machines at banks and credit unions and the like, for various reasons, because some of them move too quickly, because some of them do not allow for the plugging of devices that permit the blind to hear the instructions. Some of them are simply set too high. And we all know, Mr. President, the profound inconvenience of that. But think about not only that, but think about that inconvenience multiplied by, or what you may take to be an inconvenience, because it is more than an inconvenience in my view, multiplied by tenfold as a person with a disability goes through their day and deals with one set of exclusion after another, after another, after another. And it is hard not to get to the point where you think that your society, the country of your birth, doesn't care for you. You are not valuable enough for it to respond to cater to accommodate, Mr. President. And that is the work of shifting that, of changing that, is the work that this government has committed to doing through the committee, through the establishment, through the crafting of comprehensive disability protections and policy. Mr. President, but I also want to say setting the law aside, if I may, that some of this will require a cultural shift. There are ways in which the force of law will be enough to compel a different set of behavior, a better set of behavior, to quote Senator Cummins. But there are ways in which all of us, as part of a society, need to be kinder, need to think about the ways, the spaces that we occupy, and the ways in which they are inaccessible to persons with disabilities for various reasons, Mr. President. And to commit to making those spaces more inclusive, commit to making them more accessible to persons with disabilities and the people who may care for them, Mr. President. I spent some time talking about education, for instance, and the inaccessibility of some modern or fairly modern technology for persons with disabilities. But I also wish to spend some time, Mr. President, on some of the other things that we often don't speak about or think about enough when we think about the lives of persons with disabilities. Things like sports, culture, entertainment, and recreation, which are really at the center of the resolution that we debate today. Mr. President, as a person with a disability, I can tell you that there is a view in this country, sometimes explicitly expressed, perhaps more problematically ingrained into the very fabric of our society, that persons with disabilities should go to school if they can, they should go to work if they are one of the 10% of persons with disabilities who has a job, they should go to the doctor if they must, they should go to religious gatherings if they're inclined so to do. However, the fun and the frolic, the festivities are not for them, to put it politely. We have a responsibility to change that. It is why this resolution and the Inclusive Play project is important, because inclusion has to be comprehensive, and it has to be rooted in the idea that persons with disabilities and special needs have a right to derive joy and fulfillment and connection from doing the things that able-bodied people get to do just because they want to. Things like playing cricket or playing the violin or chipping down the road on Kadooment Day, whatever it is their heart desires to do, Mr. President. We must create platforms where children with disabilities and special needs can share their talents, and in some instances, those will be dedicated. Those will need to be dedicated spaces, and in other instances, Mr. President, we must work to ensure that activities are sufficiently accessible to those children, to ensure that if they want to play kiddie cricket or play in one of our national orchestras, they can do so, Mr. President. Because the thing that I think that we don't think about is the extent to which when we refuse to accommodate persons with disabilities, that we are also limiting their own self-actualization. We often in this country think about persons with disabilities as people to do things for, and not people who want to do things. And that is part of the cultural shift that needs to occur, Mr. President. And so it means that we have to be inclined to develop capacity across our country in treating to persons with disabilities. It means that sporting coaches, for instance, have to be trained in instructing persons with disabilities. Because when we don't do that, are we not limiting the capacity of the person with a disability and limiting the capacity of the country, Mr. President? Are we not foreclosing on the possibility of another Jason Holder or Sade Williams or Zane Maloney, Mr. President? Those are the things that we have to think about. Similarly, Mr. President, public play parks need to be retrofitted in the vein of this, in the same vein of this resolution, to accommodate persons with disabilities, Mr. President. And similarly, we need to appropriately reward and recognize persons with disabilities and special needs and children with special needs for their sporting and cultural achievements, Mr. President. If we are to make the point that this country is for all of us. An important element of this idea of accessibility that I think that we often, and inclusion that we sometimes forget about in these conversations, Mr. President, is the idea of exposure. Exposure is critical to aspiration, so that we must ensure that persons with disabilities, children with disabilities and special needs are exposed to a myriad of endeavors, so that, as I said, they can see a Jason Holder and say, I want to do that, and they can see a Zane Maloney and say, I want to do that as well, Mr. President. It is my ask through you, Mr. President, that Barbadians in all of their spaces think about the ways that this country can be better, can be more inclusive to and for persons with disabilities. I think the project and promise of this country, Mr. President, depends on it. In addition to the, and again, the leader of government business referred to it, in addition to the substantive work the government has committed to doing around disability, there has also been a commitment, Mr. President, to creating the enabling environment to allow greater and easier civil society participation, so that projects like these are not one-offs, but that they become routine and they become ingrained in our society, so that the idea of a civil society organization visioning and crafting a project that responds to some of the most pressing needs of this country is easier. Because, Mr. President, making this country the best it can be requires all of us, and certainly requires the kind of structural realities that permits organizations and people of goodwill to create solutions, and to confront contemporary issues through the crafting of programs and policies that serve us all. In that same vein, I wish to encourage Barbadians to volunteer not only with one of the 21 organizations under the auspices of the Barbados Council for the Disabled, but to do so in other areas as well. Civil society organizations, regardless of their focus, Mr. President, are doing good work. And they require and deserve our assistance in carrying that work out. We need to ensure that we ingrain and, in some instances, reinvigorate in our country a culture of volunteerism. I am pleased every time I see, particularly the nation's young people out reading to children on a Saturday morning at a library, or I see them pass and I see them handing out food to the homeless, Mr. President. But we need to ensure that that becomes the impulse of all of us, so as to make this country the best it can be. Sir, I wholeheartedly support this resolution and commend it to this House. Mr. President, I am obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Boyce. The speakers, Senator Dr. Haynes.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. I'd like to open by commending Senator Andrele Boyce for his advocacy on behalf of members of the disabled community, both in this space and in other places. As we know, he sits on the committee for the disabled that will be seeking to ensure that the lives of disabled Barbadians, people living with disabilities in Barbados, is improved and enhanced. One of the things that stood out to me, both in reading the resolution and in listening to the contributions that have come forward so far, is that we are presenting inclusive play, this concept, as something that is revolutionary. And I said it's so unfortunate that inclusion would be portrayed as a revolutionary act, because it would suggest that the status quo is exclusion. And it's really, really heartbreaking when you think about it, and it really underscores the amount of work that we have to do. Myself and a few colleagues would have sat in the chamber during the previous parliamentary term when we adopted a resolution on the Charter of Barbados, which would have spoken to the fact that Barbadians have they're free and equal in terms of human dignity and human rights, regardless of their age, their ability, their race, their sexual orientation, class, culture, faith, a full spectrum of things. But clearly we have our work cut out, and I would like to commend the Rotary Club for this initiative on behalf of Barbados's children. One of the things that I would like to underscore is that as much as we're placing an emphasis on children who are living with disabilities, this inclusive play part is intended for children of all ability levels. The challenge is that traditionally, in typical play parks and spaces that children would normally access, you have monkey bars and slides and seesaws that never sought to accommodate children living with physical or other challenges. So here we are trying to make wrong things right, and I'm proud that as a legislature, we can lend our support in this way to help a civil society organization make some progress that is consistent with our vision for what we hope Barbados can be. I wanted to point out a statistic. It was quite shocking to learn that over 240 million children worldwide live with disabilities. And traditionally, we think of disabilities in terms of either a motor delay, or we think of visual or hearing impairment. But increasingly, we're seeing a number of invisible disabilities on the rise. Senator Cummins would have made reference in her presentation to the child of a friend of hers who is living with autism. And the fact is that 1 in 68 children have autism. It is the fastest growing developmental disability worldwide. And while these numbers are on the rise, we have found that our educational system has failed to keep pace. Our recreational spaces have failed to keep pace with the realities that more and more and more children are being born with the condition, with with autism, with ADHD, with other invisible disabilities. I would even categorize things like hemoglobinopathies, things like hemophilia, where if you kick a football or you're playing a football game and it hits you in the wrong place, you could get a catastrophic bleed. I've seen children with osteogenesis imperfecta where the bones are so brittle that, they have to be kept back and protected in a way. So to see that the Rotary is formulating a space that, yes, seeks to make the play park accessible not just to children with physical challenges, but they're also factoring in things like sensory play. I see that one of the things that they're also doing is having a room that's soft, it has soft padding. So let's say a child with a hemoglobinopathy, with osteogenesis imperfecta, with a challenge like that, the parents wouldn't have to worry in a way that they normally would. One of the things that I wanted to speak to briefly, though, was the fact that, yes, we are making the land space available for the development, and we are focusing primarily on the physical infrastructure during the course of this debate. But I wanted to make a call to Barbadians who might have these specialist skill sets or an interest in pursuing studies in these fields to get involved. I cannot tell you how long the wait times are to get assessments, how challenging it is to find the behavioral therapists, the occupational therapists, the speech therapists, the physiotherapists that can lend support to these children. We really need to build up capacity in these ways. We need more and more teachers sensitized to understand the signs and to know what to look for. I mean, we have cases where sometimes even well-educated people don't notice sometimes that the meltdowns might be associated with something, that the behavioral challenges are just a sign of the frustration that the child is experiencing because of the challenges that they're having in terms of communication and in terms of socialization. So I really want to beg on those who might have these skill sets or might have an interest in pursuing study to get involved, because I can tell you there is, as someone who has access services on behalf of a child in the private sector, a significant amount of personal resources have to be spent in order to support a child in that way. And I would really like to see things built out in a way that even if I didn't have the money to do it, I wouldn't have to worry about my child falling through the cracks. So there's a lot of scope, and I think this is a very, very noble start. As Senator Boyce would have said, I hope this is not a one-off and that we see more and more organizations take on the mantle of trying to make Barbados a more equitable place to live for all people. I wanted to segue briefly onto childhood obesity. This is something that the Heart and Stroke Foundation, you can't miss the ads popping up in your timeline if you're on social media, the advertisements. And one of the things that I noticed in my research in terms of preparing for this debate is that children living with disabilities are actually at greater risk of childhood obesity for a few reasons, including the fact that they tend to be sedentary, whether it's a case of a physical handicap or, as Senator Boyce would have indicated, parents who are looking after a child who has a disability. The tendency, yes, you have to be the advocate on behalf of your child, but there's a tendency to want to protect them because you feel like they can't advocate for themselves, and that might be incorrect because our kids are tough and resilient, but we really need to understand that keeping the kids sedentary, keeping the kids in the house is not necessarily good for them for a couple of reasons. It's increasing the risk of childhood obesity. It's increasing the risk of conditions like depression. And it's also limiting their social interaction and social skills. And we cannot underestimate the value of play in the development of a child. It is through play that children learn things like teamwork. It is through play that children build healthy bones and joints. They reduce their risk of diabetes. They improve their cardiovascular health. It is through a lesson I learned at occupational therapy that joint pressure, actually just by a child jumping up and down on a bed, that joint pressure actually causes the release of serotonin, which counteracts the stress levels of the child and helps them to settle and focus. So having that bit of exercise before you start your day, there's actually a bit of science there's a bit of science underlying it that I think that we really don't value or fully understand the value of play in terms of our day-to-day lives. I wanted to, in closing up my brief presentation this afternoon, mention briefly the value of partnerships. So we would see that the Rotary Club has made this particular initiative, it's like a pioneering project, I believe. But I would like to also take the opportunity to credit the work of the World Pediatric Project and the Sandy Lane Charitable Trust, who jointly ran an initiative earlier this year, where they, in particular, worked with the orthopedic department of the QEH, and they had a specialist clinic run back in May that saw 85 children who were either living with bone deformity conditions or some kind of underlying orthopedic issue. And World Pediatric, in conjunction with the Sandy Lane Charitable Trust, in the last 8 years, has actually done over 180 surgeries, either for scoliosis or Blount's disease or other joint disorders, in order to help children that would otherwise be out of the running, literally, helping them to get back on their feet and helping to improve their mobility. So I wanted to commend organizations, not just Rotary, but the Sandy Lane Charitable Trust, World Pediatric Project, the Maria Holder Trust, Variety Club, Canadian Women's Club, all the individual donors, and more recently, who's come on board to partner with the Ministry of Health and the QEH in particular, has been the Sick Kids Hospital. You might have recently, if you have driven past the QEH, recently seen the Shaw Center for Pediatric Excellence sign go up. That partnership agreement would have been signed back in 2020. And that initiative is actually committed to creating a healthcare standard in the pediatric department that is world-class. So you would have seen recently at the UWI graduation that 20 nurses would have either graduated with postgraduate diplomas in pediatrics or would have graduated with master's degrees and specialist master's degrees in pediatric nursing. And that particular educational initiative would have been facilitated through the Shaw Program for Pediatric Excellence. And the initiative is not just based on creating a stronger educational thrust in the department, because the understanding is if we can educate and equip the staff to deal with clinical management of sick children, that it would overall improve the health and welfare of Barbadian children. But further to this, what they're also looking to do is to invest in actually refurbishing the pediatric units, not just the pediatric ward, but the pediatric intensive care unit, the NICU, and the outpatients department. So there is a significant thrust overall that I can see coming together to support the welfare and the well-being of Barbadian children. And I am very pleased this afternoon to stand to support this resolution. With that, Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Haynes. You still want to speak? Oh. You want to? Any other speakers before we wrap up?
I'm going to speak, I think.
Senator, Her Honor, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I believe that we will all get an opportunity to speak to the issue of disabilities and policy and the life of those with disabilities and how we better integrate them as true children of the Trident when the debate comes. But I really did want to take this opportunity really to make very brief remarks on another matter. Our 2022 manifesto of the Barbados Labour Party, which is an extremely condensed document, less than half the size of the 2018 manifesto endorses and commits to the policies enunciated in 2018 as being our platform for government and governance, particularly on a range of issues. Having laid that groundwork then, I go to the 2018 manifesto of the Barbados Labour Party at page 46, at which one finds these words. There are more than 1,000 registered third sector organizations in Barbados in the form of not-for-profits, operating outside the spheres of the public and private sectors. Third sector organizations cater to children, youth, the elderly, people with mental and physical disabilities, the poor, people in abusive relationships, the homeless, the unemployed, caregivers, substance abusers, artists, and other creatives. And I must apologize because it is clear now that I did not photograph the entire section, which I think goes on to make the point. Searching for it very quickly, sir. The BLP recognizes the meaningful impact a progressive third sector policy might make in helping to meet growing social needs, accelerating entrepreneurship, and social impact investing. In addition, the third sector will be instrumental in generating new jobs and foreign exchange, building a more caring society, and serving as a partner in the attainment of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. A Barbados Labour Party government will establish and work with a steering committee of third sector groups to promote and facilitate the development of a thriving, connected, engaged, energized, and effective third sector in Barbados, capable of strong social and economic impact and of positioning Barbados as an international center for third sector engagement and collaboration. Mr. President, I think that what it is being proposed this evening to allow in order to enable the Rotary Club of Barbados to give effect to exactly what is spoken to in the 2018 manifesto is of significance. That the third sector, properly incentivized, can carry a range of functions and services that government at this time does not necessarily have the skills or the resources to carry. They can do so with goodwill. They can do so effectively. They can do so by hiring and recruiting and creating jobs in the economy, and more important, that they can satisfy a genuine need in the society, a gaping need in the society on a range of issues, and the manifesto itself speaks to them. I would wish to encourage us as an administration not to forget this particular provision of the 2018 manifesto. We committed to establishing a committee. I believe that we can set up a third sector umbrella organization with a chairmanship who will act as a liaison between the multiple third sector organizations in the society and the administration, give advice as to what they need or give guidance as to what they need, how government can truly incentivize and be helpful, and also to share policy perspectives with third sector organizations. There is a role for the third sector. They are thirsty to help in some way. They just need direction and proper engagement and facilitation and the creation of the appropriate environment, whatever those incentives may be, in order to allow them to give effect to their charitable pursuits, to properly and better give effect to their charitable pursuits. In a previous Labour Party administration within the Ministry of Health, it was in the manifesto, and then we gave rise to it. There was because health has perhaps some of the largest numbers of NGOs and groups. Well, perhaps environment has now exceeded them, but previously, health used to have the largest number. And we set up an umbrella body within the Ministry of Health to engage and coordinate and give support to these various organizations that were working as third sector entities in the society. Mr. President, as I said, I'm sure that we will have an opportunity for a full debate on persons with disabilities, but the fact that this, whether we so intend or not, does give rise to a manifesto provision which we need to fully roll out and act on, is something to which I wanted to point at this time. And I believe that the Honourable Colin Jordan has responsibility for third sector engagement, and I would really wish to see that we do carry out this particular area. It will be helpful to the administration, but it will be helpful to the country. And it will perhaps, when persons see what can be accomplished by persons of goodwill who are largely working in volunteer organizations, that it might encourage an increased level of volunteerism at the national level. There are many people with skills, with resources of all types, and if they can put those skills or resources at the disposal of the country and at the disposal of those who most need them. I think Senator Dr. Haynes spoke very well about the cost of doing so, and there are many families who are in situations where their resources cannot afford to deal with the particular needs and challenges which their families face, whether it is because they have a child who is mentally or physically challenged or differently able, whether it is because Granny has developed Alzheimer's in her old age and everybody has to work and they can't cope. There are all kinds of avenues for the third sector, and the space is large for the third sector to enter, engage, but as a government, we have to give the incentives and the support. So that is really my contribution to this simple residual matter, simply to say that I want to see us act on this, and I'm very glad that insofar as this residual attempts to do so, that it does give effect to Labour Party policy as framed in the 2018 manifesto. We now need really to give full effect. Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Sir Honourable Senator Thompson. Further speakers? Senator Cummins, sorry. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to, first of all, express appreciation to all of the honourable members of the chamber who have spoken. This is very much a simple matter. It is in the first instance the rescission, and then it is the vesting on the other hand in items 3 and 4 respectively. There will be obviously a matter that we will speak to when the President intervenes. Your microphone. But I want to, first of all, on the matter of the Inclusive Play Project, support all of the comments and the interventions that have been made. There are any number of projects to which we could all speak. I could have, during my initial presentation, I think the beauty and perhaps the challenge of times of opening and closing is that you have to make sure that you split what you would say in half. But I could speak to a range of projects that we've done. How many people, in this case, we're talking about persons with disabilities, persons with special needs, and those persons who are living without those challenges, integrating into an inclusive play project. But how many social service entities have involved themselves in a range of projects? We have the Homeless and Vagrant Society, which is functioning here outside of Parliament buildings very often, and also in Bridgetown, supporting those in the homeless. We have the Barbados Red Cross Society. They have been critical in their disaster response and post-disaster response. They have a specific demographic that they are focusing on. Going back to the Rotary Club, we have had a pacemaker bank project in this country for many, many years where persons who have heart conditions are able to benefit, in particular if they're qualified as indigent, from free pacemakers. We have had all kinds of instances historically in this country where third sector organizations come together and support the national objectives. In this instance where Senator Thompson ended is where I also want to end. In an environment where government resources are stretched, where government's resources, both in terms of financial and human resources, are stretched to capacity, but our needs are still what they are. The vulnerable in society are still with us. In fact, in some instances, some may argue that they have become more vulnerable. There has to be a move in this country to collaborate alongside our third sector institutions, right hand in hand with government, because government simply cannot do it all, even with the best of intentions. And this project is a classic example, as has been all of the other projects that all of our third sector institutions have supported and collaborated on. This has been the nation's best example of national pride, national interest, national collaboration, and it is on this basis, Mr. President, that I beg to move that these resolutions do not pass, but I will treat, first of all, Mr. President, to...
The question, resolution number 3 only.
I was coming there, Mr. President,
Please.
but I do wish to ask first that order number 3, the passing of the resolution that to rescind the initial resolution, that this resolution do now pass.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummins. In relation to agenda item number 3, we thank Senator Tate, whose eagle legal eye caught the use of Her Excellency rather than His Excellency. Checks were made by the Clerk of Parliament, and in fact, I am advised that the Acting Governor General on that date was Sir Philip Graves, who is, by no stretch of the imagination, in any kind of legal system or any use of the ordinary language, could be described as her. We're not there yet. This is clearly a typo. The clerk has advised that in a regular parliamentary practice, typos which do not affect the substance the adjustments are made by the clerks and initial in the official record. If there is no objection, we will follow that practice, and the clerk will in the official record reflect the correction of the typo to reflect His Excellency rather than Her Excellency for agenda item number 3. If there's no dissent, thank you very much, Senator Tate, once again. We truly appreciate your catching the eye, because I agree with you, this is the upper chamber. We want to ensure that there are no errors or omissions in any of the items on which we have to vote. So the question is that the item number 3, the resolution to rescind a previous resolution relating to this lease to the Rotary Club of Barbados South, we do not pass.
Mr. President, excuse me, would you not have to say as amended? If you're amending, would you not have to say as amended?
No, I'm advised by the clerk that the typos are not treated as amendments. So if, a, but, the, and his, so that if there was a substantive amendment, then we would have to move a motion and to amend the resolution and pass as amended. That's my advice from the clerk, that those matters are not formal amendments on which you enter the record as amended.
Much obliged, sir, for your explanation.
Yes, thank you very much, Senator Tate, for that query. So the question is that this resolution do not pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. You call number 4 first.
Order number 4, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the State Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, the lease to the Rotary Inclusive Play Trust, a charity registered as charity number 910 under the Charities Act, Chapter 243, a parcel of land, the property of the state, situate at Garfield Service Complex, Upton in the parish of Christchurch in this island, for the construction and development of a recreational facility for children with disabilities.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
The question is that this resolution for the lease of land so described to the Rotary Inclusive Play Trust, charity number 910 under Charities Act, Chapter 243, do not pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it, this resolution is now passed. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This brings us to the end of government business for today. I beg to move that this Senate do now be adjourned, sine die, with the proviso that we are most likely to meet again on Wednesday, December 14th.
Senator Dr. Hines.
Thank you, Mr. President. Once again, I rise to ask a question about a question. I eagerly await a response on the question relating to, well, you know what it is, child protection legislation that I've heard so much about in the news, but not in here. And also, importantly, the second part, which relates to juvenile justice.
Remember, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The response has been drafted, it has been finalized, and it is to be submitted formally to this honorable chamber, we expect very shortly.
Thank you for that update. We look forward eagerly to receiving the formal submission of that, or the answer to that question. The question is that the Senate do not adjourn sine die. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The Senate stands adjourned.